Today, the term fascist is thrown around carelessly in political discourse, stripped of its actual meaning and used as a simple pejorative for one's political opponents. Within the context of Israeli politics, figures such as Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and Bezalel Smotrich are routinely branded with this label, and at times, even the entire state of Israel itself is accused of being a fascist project. But what does fascism even mean? To answer that question, one must understand that real and historical fascism is a specific revolutionary nationalist political ideology centered upon the ideals of national rebirth, syndicalist economics, producerism, and a powerful state. Much of what is popularly quote-unquote understood about fascism today is entirely disconnected from its concrete history. For those interested in a deeper dive into authentic fascist ideology and not some partisan caricature, I would recommend the videos shown on screen now. Though fascism is in fact non-existent in the modern state of Israel, it was at one point one of the most powerful political forces within British Mandatory Palestine prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. The origins of fascism's presence in the land of Israel began in the early 1920s, with the emergence of a certain sect of Zionism known by the name of Revisionism. The Revisionist Zionists were not themselves fascists in their earliest years, and in fact, they initially drew far more upon the broader well of liberal traditions. Yet as time went on, the Revisionists eventually embraced fascist ideology with open arms. But why was revisionism founded? Who were its leaders? How did it change as geopolitics and regional politics evolved? And most intriguingly, why did it turn to fascism as the solution to the political problems of the Jewish people? To understand why such a prominent sect of Zionists found fascism so appealing, we actually have to dive into the state of Zionism following World War I. In the immediate aftermath of the First World War, the Zionist movement, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, prioritized a cautious and diplomatic relationship with the British Empire, hoping to negotiate terms for settlement efforts. This pragmatic strategy succeeded in establishing Jewish agricultural cooperatives as well as in expanding Jewish immigration within Mandatory Palestine. Despite its successes in expanding the Jewish presence in the region, many Jews were unsatisfied with this complacent strategy, including a certain Jewish Zionist of Ukrainian origin named Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who believed that the Zionists had failed to address the existential threat posed by both British and Arab imperial interests. According to Jabotinsky, the Zionist movement needed to outright declare its ultimate goal, the establishment of a Jewish state, and it must prepare from the outset both political and military means to achieve this goal, through openly asserting the right of the Jewish people over the entire land of Israel and firmly standing against the settlement limitations placed upon the Jewish people by the British Empire. Ze'ev Jabotinsky threw himself against the grain of Zionist consensus. Ever since 1919, Jabotinsky had been deeply inspired by the early Italian fascist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, whom he had first referred to in the newspaper Haaretz as, quote, the poet of spiritual aristocracy in our generation, standing above a cliff and longing for something sublime which he himself could not yet grasp, unquote. While imprisoned by the British in 1920, Jabotinsky had spent his time translating Gabriele D'Annunzio's poems into Hebrew, and as pointed out by Ari M. Dubnov, throughout the early 1920s, Jabotinsky modeled himself upon this eccentric and avant-garde Italian warrior poet. Ever since the late 1890s, Jabotinsky had looked with inspiration towards Italian revolutionaries, including Giuseppe Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini, whose liberalism was extremely foundational for his worldview. In his own words, quote, if I have a spiritual homeland, it is Italy. All my attitude towards the problems of nation, state, and society was formed in those years under Italian influence. The legend of Garibaldi, the writings of Mazzini, the poetry of Leopardi and Giusti enriched and deepened my superficial Zionism, turning it from an instinctive feeling into a worldview, unquote. In October of 1923, the World Zionist Organization rejected Jabotinsky's radical ideas and refused to even acknowledge any clear state-building goal. Jabotinsky immediately resigned from the organization and called for his followers to revise Zionist strategy to align their means with their ends. That same year, Jabotinsky began publishing the Russian Zionist newspaper Rassvet, or Dawn, which proudly declared its goal of establishing a single Israeli state on both banks of the Jordan. Then, on November 4th of 1923, Jabotinsky published his most famous writing ever, titled The Iron Wall, in Rassvet. In The Iron Wall, Jabotinsky argued that Zionist colonization in Mandatory Palestine required an unbreachable iron wall of security, whether British or Jewish, as the native Arab population would never consent to its own colonization. Invoking precedent from the Aztecs to the North American Indians, Jabotinsky insisted that a peaceful agreement would be impossible with the Arabs until they recognized that the Zionist settlement was irreversible. In this essay, Jabotinsky equally rebuked both the naive peacemongers who presumed Arab ignorance of the Zionist vision, as well as the cynical Arabophiles who believed in buying off local Arab leaders. In his own words, quote, "To imagine, as our Arabophiles do, that they will voluntarily consent to the realization of Zionism in return for the moral and material conveniences which the Jewish colonist brings with him is a childish notion which has at bottom a kind of contempt for the Arab people. It means that they despise the Arab race, which they regard as a corrupt mob that can be bought and sold, and are willing to give up their fatherland for a good railway system." Unquote. In The Iron Wall, Jabotinsky in fact praised the Arabs as astute defenders of what they saw as their own homeland, and he pointed out that their accurate understanding of Zionism's aims only strengthened their resolve against the pacifists who then dominated the Zionist movement. Jabotinsky saw his proposed iron wall of defense not only as an end in and of itself, but as a means to eventually reconcile with the Arabs. Only when the Arabs ceased in aspiring to reverse Jewish migration could reasonable voices emerge on both sides to negotiate mutual guarantees such as equal rights and peaceful coexistence. In Jabotinsky's eyes, Zionism was moral and justice would demand that the Jewish people have both unwavering resolve and firm protection. But why was Jabotinsky so opposed to, say, a two-state solution? Why was he so convicted of his Iron Wall doctrine? In Jabotinsky's eyes, the two-state solution had already lost all hope due to the behavior of the Arabs in Mandatory Palestine over the course of the preceding century. During the Ottoman era, driven by resentment against the conscription policies and modernizing reforms instituted by the Egyptian ruler Mehemet Ali, which were perceived as favorable to Jews and Christians, a widespread Palestinian Arab peasant revolt had erupted in 1834. This revolt quickly spiraled into a mass, brutal assault on the Jewish and Christian population. Multiple sides of the rebellion led a campaign of mass murder, rape, and looting that targeted Jewish communities across the region. The most sustained atrocity began on June 15th in the city of Safed, where armed Arab and Bedouin villagers unleashed a month-long pogrom against the Jewish population. The community was subjected to 33 days of relentless violence, as documented by historian Asad Rostum from the American University of Beirut, who personally published the Egyptian documents regarding the revolt. The official report on Jerusalem from the time noted, quote, "The houses of Jews were destroyed in an intentional manner until there was not even a bed left to sleep on. Masses from them were killed, and their women and daughters were attacked," unquote. This account is corroborated by the mournful writings of the surviving Safed community itself, which later recorded, quote, "And they arose with a strong arm and murder in their bones. Some of them they killed with burning sticks, and some of them they cut down with swords. Many women were raped and defiled," unquote. Synagogues were looted and burned, and over 500 Palestinian Jews were slaughtered in Safed alone. Following this, in early August of the same year, the Hebron massacre occurred, in which 12 Jews were killed, despite Ottoman demands that the Jews be left unharmed as they had nothing to do with the Battle of Hebron. In the 1838 Safed pogrom, the Arabs rebelled against Egyptian rule by attacking Jews in Palestine for 3 days, plundering homes and raping Jewish women, causing many Palestinian Jews to flee to Jerusalem. Decades later, starting in 1914 and continuing until 1921, the Jewish community in Ottoman and Mandatory Palestine endured a series of devastating blows, beginning with the systematic deportation and persecution of the Yishuv, the Jewish community during World War I. Between 1914 and 1917, the Ottoman authorities, with extensive and willing facilitation by the local Palestinian Arab population, orchestrated the deportation of tens of thousands of Jews from Palestine in a series of deliberate death marches. Large Arab crowds and armed groups, alongside Palestinian Arab regiments in the Ottoman army itself, would actively round up thousands of Jews from their cities and homes. Those who resisted were executed on the spot, as in Jerusalem, where Yemenite Jews were hanged over bridges as a public warning. The seized Jews were then handed over to the Ottoman military to be force-marched out of the country. The most well-documented instance of this was the Jaffa deportation, where approximately 10,000 Jews were expelled. The death marches were designed to induce starvation and exposure, resulting in a massive undocumented loss of life. While the discovered bodies and documented deaths from the Jaffa deportation alone number at least 1,800, historians agree that this is a low count, as many victims were buried in unmarked mass graves along the route. The death toll for this single deportation is estimated to be around 20%. This method was applied so widely that the vast majority of the Yishuv was affected, devastating its population, which wouldn't recover for years. I don't merely mean this economically, I mean that most of the population did not return. This campaign was fundamentally different from Ottoman orders regarding Arabs, who were at times asked to temporarily evacuate areas like Gaza and Jaffa, but were never subjected to the systematic ethnic cleansing or death marches as the Palestinian Jews were. Jabotinsky, upon witnessing the thousands of Jewish refugees from these death marches arriving in Alexandria, Egypt, was motivated to propose the creation of a Jewish legion to fight with the British Empire against the Ottomans. This idea, embraced by famous Zionists such as Yosef Trumpeldor, was the genesis of a shift towards organized Jewish self-defense in the name of Zionism. With the collapse of Ottoman rule and the establishment of the British Mandate, which endorsed the Balfour Declaration, Arab violence against Jews escalated rapidly. The Balfour Declaration allowed for a Jewish national home to thrive within Mandatory Palestine, a prospect that the Arab population would never stand for. After this point, large-scale riots and targeted attacks became commonplace. From April 4th to April 7th of 1920, the Nebi Musa riots erupted in Jerusalem, where Arab mobs, comprising 35% of the adult male Palestinian Arab population, attacked the Jewish quarter of the Old City. They ransacked homes, raided the Torat Chaim yeshiva, burned Torah scrolls, and engaged in widespread looting, burglary, rape, and murder as British forces initially withdrew. However, the violence was not confined to just urban centers. On March 1st of 1920, an Arab attack on the settlement of Tel Hai killed 2 Jews, and in a far more devastating instance, Bedouin raiding parties conducted a series of attacks across northern Palestine. In just one such raid on the settlement of Samak in 1920, 42 Jews were killed, with many more dying in subsequent battles to retake the settlement. When combined with the riots in Jerusalem and other individual assassinations, the total number of Jews killed by the Arabs in 1920 alone was in the low hundreds. This violence continued into 1921 with the Jaffa riots from May 1st to 7th, yet again initiated by Arab mobs, which looted, murdered, and attacked Jews and their properties in Jaffa, Petah Tikva, and the surrounding areas. Among the 47 Jews killed was the prominent Ukrainian Jewish writer Yosef Chaim Brenner. In response to the relentless violence of the Palestinian Arabs, the Jewish Defense Force, the Haganah, adopted a policy known as Havlagah, or restraint. This policy of restraint was so strictly defensive that it even forbade retaliatory attacks on military targets. A Haganah soldier was only permitted to fire his weapon when an assailant was in the immediate visible act of trying to kill him or another Jew. This extreme form of self-restraint was intended to prevent escalation and maintain British support, though it would come to mark the beginning of a deep split within the Zionist movement between those who sought a solely defensive strategy and those who desired the immediate establishment of a Jewish state. With this context in mind, Ze'ev Jabotinsky considered a two-state solution infeasible. The immediacy of Jabotinsky's new revisionist Zionist current attracted countless young Zionists, particularly Eastern European Jewish youth, who, yearning for the self-determination of their own people, were entirely disenchanted with the Zionist movement's cautious and slow strategy of pragmatic compromise. In July of 1925, in a backroom meeting in the Latin Quarter of Paris's Café du Panthéon, Jabotinsky and some 24 Jewish activists formally established the Alliance of Revisionist Zionists, also known as Hatzohar. The organization declared itself a political movement dedicated to unreservedly asserting Jewish sovereignty over Mandatory Palestine and Transjordan, demanding the British facilitation of free Jewish migration. It sought to secure land rights, including public and uncultivated lands, for Jewish settlement as well. Hatzohar's constitution codified every last one of these aims. Though it garnered only 7% of the World Zionist Organization's vote in 1929, the Revisionist Zionist movement had established itself as a clear ideological alternative to the prevailing current of the Zionist movement. From the outset, Jabotinsky recognized that a mass youth movement would be crucial to the success of the Zionist project. In 1923, in Riga, then in independent Latvia, Jabotinsky founded a youth movement which went by the name of Betar, also known as Brit Yosef Trumpeldor, named after the Zionist pioneer Yosef Trumpeldor. Betar's ethos combined a number of elements. First and foremost, Hebrew linguistic revival, as the organization used Hebrew in all of its activities. Secondarily, national discipline, as Betar initiated military-style drill, uniforms, and strict codes of conduct. Third, it believed that hadar, nobility, courtesy, physical fitness, was to be venerated as the ideal lifestyle. Finally, Betar upheld combat readiness, believing basic military training to be necessary to prepare the youth for eventual defense duties in the name of the national good. Betar's ranks would swell from 9,000 members in 1929 to 80,000 by 1939, spreading throughout Europe in diaspora and across the Middle East. In Palestine, Betar graduates defended Tel Aviv during the 1929 riots, formed local defense platoons in Galilee and Samaria, and later established the Wailing Wall Company at the Old City of Jerusalem. In his aforementioned 1923 essay, Jabotinsky had argued that peaceful negotiations with Arab nationalist leaders were futile. He wrote, quote, "The only way to reach agreement is via an iron wall, i.e., an army strong enough that no Arab pressure can undermine the Jewish national home," unquote. In 1931, this doctrine informed dissident members of the Haganah, frustrated by its restraint, who formed Irgun Escalates, later known simply as the Irgun, which was led by a cadre of Betar alumni. Though not under Jabotinsky's direct control, the Irgun shared in his rejection of Britain's limitations upon Jewish self-determination. The Irgun would come to be dominated by ideological fascists on the militia level, despite its leaders being somewhat ideologically pragmatic. From 1929 onwards, the revisionist camp began to fracture between Jabotinsky's disciplined liberal nationalist vision and a younger, more radical current centered upon a figure named Abba Ahimeir. Ahimeir, a Ukrainian-born Jew, had made his permanent return to Mandatory Palestine in the summer of 1924. While studying in Vienna from 1921 to 24, he had been profoundly influenced by Oswald Spengler's morphological theory of cultures, which proposed that cultures are living organisms with life cycles. Ahimeir applied this to conceive of nations as living wholes, valorizing cultural destiny and the collective will over abstract individualism. Upon returning to Palestine, Ahimeir joined a moderate socialist party known as the Young Worker, a practical necessity for finding work, as it was a constituent party of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Laborers. The Histadrut was a comprehensive labor union that controlled employment, banking, and healthcare. By 1927, it represented 70% of the Jewish labor force. Through this affiliation, Ahimeir secured work as a librarian within the Histadrut's Cultural Committee in Zikron Yaakov, and as a teacher in the kibbutzim of Nahalal and Giva, placing him at the forefront of Zionist labor and education. However, Ahimeir's perspective rapidly diverged from the labor establishment. The Histadrut, while professing socialist solidarity, operated as a restricted club, excluding non-Jewish laborers and even unaffiliated Jewish workers. Ahimeir identified with dissident groups within the Young Worker, such as the groups of the Toilers, Zionists who had experienced Soviet rule and were critical of prevailing socialist ideals. For them, the labor movement's primary focus needed to be the national Zionist project, not international class struggle. Though Ahimeir respected Vladimir Lenin as a revolutionary who achieved his objectives, he was no Bolshevik and no admirer of the communist doctrines. As early as 1923, Ahimeir had expressed fascination with Italian fascism, writing, quote, "Today I saw, finally, a picture of fascists on the cover of an illustrated weekly. In the picture, we see the fascists dressed in black shirts, right arm outstretched, no hats covering their black hair. Some young girls fell in love with these youths, with their swift gait and glistening eyes. Is it possible not to become enamored? Youths in black shirts, their eyes glistening with an abundance of faith in these defining moments, their right arms raised at their sides. How could the lasses not fall in love?" Unquote. His journalistic work from 1924 to 26 for the Young Workers' Journal became a platform to develop his critique. In 1926, he wrote, quote, "And why do we become embittered by fascism, by its deeds of violence? All these youngsters are ready to kill and be killed for the sake of the homeland, so that the name of the fascist leader will be recorded in history. The movement increases their life spirit. Is the youth guilty of the fact that he has so much verve but nowhere to squander it? Our epoch is one of men of action. They rely on their weapons. They are the rulers. They set the tone in many lands." Unquote. During this period, Ahimeir developed a critical outlook on contemporary syndicalism, which he saw as increasingly subsumed by conservative and nationalistic forces. He analyzed what he termed neo-democracy, a trend towards conservatism where trade unions were beginning to emulate parliamentary talking shops. For Ahimeir, this represented a fundamental discrepancy between democratic ideology and democratic rule, where a conservative minority, the trade union bureaucracy, governed a passive majority. Ahimeir's understanding of syndicalism was shaped by his reading of Robert Michels's Socialism and Fascism as Political Movements in Italy. In a 1926 review, Ahimeir agreed with Michels's argument that socialism's humanistic element had driven its more activist syndicalist elements to embrace fascism. Michels proposed 3 reasons for fascism's victory over socialism. First, the fatalism inherent in Marxism was disadvantageous compared to fascist activism. Second, fascism was younger and more imbued with military spirit. And third, socialism's humanism, again, drove its syndicalists towards fascism. Ahimeir himself drew a distinction between syndicalism and Marxism, noting that revolutionary syndicalism represented a revision of Marxism that concentrated on its political rather than economic message. He observed that in Italy, unions were fascist, while in Britain and America, unions had nothing to do with socialism, demonstrating that proletarian internationalism had been overpowered by nationalism. For Ahimeir, the reason was simple. Quote, "The worker lives his daily life while the intelligentsia hallucinates about the days of the Messiah of Marx's teaching." Unquote. Ahimeir's analysis extended to anarchist Catalonia, where he concluded that its embrace of generic anarchist federalism had led to the downfall of its nationalist movement. The Catalan nation had been let down by its liberals and intellectuals, a lesson not lost on Ahimeir, who was determined that Zionism would not suffer the same fate. He believed that in Spain, Primo de Rivera's fascist regime had been the final nail in Spanish anarchic federalism's coffin. By 1928, Ahimeir had concluded that the labor establishment had fundamentally compromised its national purpose. He applied this critique to the Yishuv, where he saw an active minority of intellectuals dominating a passive majority in institutions like the Tel Aviv municipality. He rejected both the workers' committees of the left Histadrut and the bourgeoisie property owners, declaring that neither one nor the other should run the city. In 1928, his ideology having matured, Ahimeir joined the Revisionist Zionists and began working for the Hebrew-language Palestine Daily Mail. Once installed in revisionist press organs, he authored a notorious series titled From the Diary of a Fascist, arguing for the primacy of the national collective over the individual and denouncing liberal pluralism in favor of cultural unity and national discipline. Ahimeir admired Europe's fascist movements as forms of national mobilization. He saw Zionist socialists as a spineless group of compromised moderates unwilling to act. He was attracted to revolutionary syndicalism for its fusion of will, myth, and direct action, as well as its separation from Marxism. He admired Mussolini's movement precisely because it combined socialist intent with nationalist ambitions, eschewing ineffectual liberal parliamentarism while retaining syndicalist organization. Moreover, fascism enjoyed strong Jewish representation and influence at every level, a fact that carried weight for Ahimeir. Soon, Ahimeir became a top leader of Jabotinsky's Betar and an instructor at the Betar Leadership Training School, which formalized an ethos of discipline, paramilitary training, and cultural education. Within Betar, his long-held virtues of nationalism, heroism, and martial virtue found an outlet. In 1930, Ahimeir founded a radical fascist political party called Brit HaBirionim, or the Covenant of the Outlaws, with 2 other ex-labor Zionists, the poet Oretz V. Greenberg and the journalist Yehoshua Yevin, both Western Ukrainian Jews. Drawing inspiration from the Italians, Brit HaBirionim adopted uniforms, military drills, and cells to wage direct action against both British rule and the rising Nazi threat. They shredded swastika flags from German consulates in Jerusalem and Jaffa in May of 1933, organized consumer boycotts of German goods, and denounced any accommodation with Nazi Germany, making them the first organized Zionist group in Palestine to mount a coherent anti-Nazi campaign. Brit HaBirionim was based upon Ahimeir's variant of Revisionist Zionism, which he called neo-revisionism, but is more commonly known as revisionist maximalism. The Maximalists called for immediate Jewish statehood, the abrogation of the British Mandate, and the creation of a one-party state on both sides of the Jordan River. They proposed the mass mobilization of the Jewish people through a formal party structure against liberalism, capitalism, and socialism. Regarding Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Ahimeir initially saw Nazism as a standard national liberation movement until Ze'ev Jabotinsky harshly corrected this view, finding it intolerable. Ahimeir and his cohort quickly shifted their stance and turned their focus to the World Zionist Organization. The WZO, headed by labor Zionists, had sought to negotiate with the Nazis to facilitate the transfer of German Jewish wealth and people to Palestine. The Revisionists denounced this in an article titled The Alliance of Stalin, Ben-Gurion, Hitler, condemning the labor Zionists for seeking compromise with Hitler. Following this article's release, Chaim Arlosoroff, who had spearheaded the labor Zionists' policy, was assassinated by rank-and-file revisionists. Ahimeir was arrested for inciting Arlosoroff's murder. Though found not guilty, the damage was done and his organization's reputation was tarnished forever. With the fall of Brit HaBirionim in 1933, the Maximalist movement proved short-lived. Though largely eclipsed by the mainstream Haganah, the Irgun, and later Lehi, Brit HaBirionim's militarism and its opposition to British imperialism left an indelible mark on the armed struggle of the Jewish people. In 1933, when asked by a student why Zionism was incompatible with communism, Ze'ev Jabotinsky replied, eviscerating communist ideology in great depth. Quote, "As regards capital, more than 90% of the money for construction comes from the pocket of our middle class, and the pure essence of communism declares for class struggle against the middle class. Wherever it conquers, it must destroy the bourgeoisie, confiscating its large fortunes. That means chopping off the only route from which capital for construction in Eretz Israel can be secured." Unquote. He went on, quote, "The essence of communism consists in that it agitates and must incite the Eastern nations against European dominance. This dominance, in its eyes, is imperialistic and exploitative. I believe otherwise, and think that European dominance makes them civilized. One thing is clear. Communism incites and must incite the Eastern nations, and this it can only do in the name of national freedom. It tells them and must tell them, your land belongs to you, and not to any strangers. This is how it must speak to the Arabs of Palestine. For our Zionist lungs, communism is suffocating gas." Unquote. Though still convinced of his liberal nationalist ideals, Jabotinsky would go on to insist that perhaps there was some truth in what fascism had to offer. Perhaps it had not been as baseless of an ideology as he had initially thought for much of the 1920s. Quote, "Fascism has some good ideas. Both strike and lockout, as well as boycott of Jewish labor, should be declared treasonable to the interest of Zionism and repressed at every legal and moral means at the nation's disposal." Unquote. In August of 1933, Ze'ev Jabotinsky attempted to organize a boycott against Nazi Germany. He first tried setting up a revisionist world union as a boycott center, but this made no sense. Telling the Jews not to buy German goods was useless, since they were already repulsed by Hitler's actions. Indeed, Jabotinsky attempted setting up an office to tell people what makes and models they could buy, but not even his most loyal followers wanted to be involved, as a serious boycott would take cash which they did not have. Jabotinsky's vision for a boycott against Hitler quickly dwindled, but Hitler was not Jabotinsky's priority regardless, as he was convinced that Hitler's regime would quickly collapse anyways. In 1934, the Revisionist movement founded the National Labor Federation in Eretz Israel as the nationalist alternative to the socialist Histadrut Union. By October of 1934, after months of repeated clashes between rival labor activists, Ze'ev Jabotinsky and David Ben-Gurion entered mediated talks in London to halt the violence between revisionists and laborites that had been occurring for months. The two men reached a written understanding to forbid partisan terror and to seek peaceful rules of engagement between their camps. However, throughout October of 1934, Histadrut activists would go on to disrupt revisionist meetings in Haifa, and there were continued regimented assaults against the revisionists across the city. In November of 1934, Benito Mussolini established a Betar Naval Squadron in Civitavecchia, where 134 revisionist cadres were trained by the fascist Blackshirts from then until 1938. One such attendee of Fascist Italy's Betar Naval Academy was a revisionist Zionist named Zvi Kolitz, who in 1936 wrote a flattering biography of Benito Mussolini titled Mussolini, His Personality and Doctrine. Kolitz would applaud fascist corporatism, declaring, quote, "The worker and the employer, the soldier and the general, all are producers. Each and every citizen plays a role of production as a part of the gigantic machine of Mussolini's state." Unquote. By 1935, frustrated with the limits of working inside the established Zionist institutions, Jabotinsky's supporters formally moved toward institutional independence, establishing the new Zionist Organization in spring of that year. In April of 1935, while in the United States, Jabotinsky, finding fascism ever more appealing, wrote an article titled Jews and Fascism, Some Remarks and a Warning. He commented, quote, "Whatever any few think of fascism's other points, there is no doubt that the Italian brand of fascist ideology is, at least, an ideology of racial equality. Let us not be so humble as to pretend that this does not matter, that racial equality is too insignificant an idea to outbalance the absence of civic freedom. For it is not true. I am a journalist who would choke without freedom of the press, but I affirm it is simply blasphemous to say that in the scale of civic rights, even the freedom of the press comes before the equality of all men. Equality comes first, always first, super first, and Jews should remember it, and to hold that a regime maintaining that principle in a world turned cannibal does, partly, but considerably atone for its other shortcomings. It may be criticized, it should not be kicked at. There are enough other terms for cussing use, Nazism, Hitlerism, police state, etc., but the word fascismo is Italy's copyright, and should therefore be reserved only for the correct kind of discussion, not for exercises in Billingsgate." Unquote. The revisionists' increasingly fascist ideological alignment was so profound that even Benito Mussolini himself commented to the later chief rabbi of Rome, Jonathan Prato, quote, "For Zionism to succeed, you need to have a Jewish state, with a Jewish flag and a Jewish language. The person who really understands that is your fascist, Jabotinsky." Unquote. Italy's alliance with the Zionist cause would only be severed in 1938, after Italy was irrevocably forced into the geopolitical camp of the Third Reich. Until the summer of 1937, the Irgun, which I previously mentioned in passing, had remained relatively obscure, overshadowed by the Haganah's Havlagah Policy, which hoped to maintain British support and prevent wider conflict. The Haganah's approach, even against military targets, meant that the Irgun's more militant stance was initially less overtly visible. However, as Arab attacks intensified against the Jewish community in Mandatory Palestine, internal dissent within the Irgun started to grow. The tides began to slowly turn against peaceable attitudes throughout 1937-39, as in the midst of the Great Arab Revolt and the slaughter of roughly 500 Palestinian Jews, the Irgun initiated its guerrilla operations against hostile Arab militias with the intent of protecting Jewish settlements, attacking British infrastructure and personnel to challenge the British Empire's restrictive immigration quotas, and providing intelligence and sabotage support to Jewish communities under siege. This marked the dusk of Zionism's policy of restraint and the genesis of a far more offensive strategy. Throughout 1938, the Irgun conducted approximately 40 operations against Arab targets, including bombings and landmine explosions, resulting in significant casualties. This period saw the Irgun not only responding to immediate threats from the Arabs, but also challenging British authority, in alignment with the Iron Wall Doctrine of Ze'ev Jabotinsky. In 1939, the revisionist Zionist and former Irgun-affiliated journalist Yonatan Ratosh, inspired by the cultural atmosphere of Fascist Italy, founded the Canaanite cultural movement. During the 1920s, Ratosh had been friends with the future infamous fascist Zionist Avraham Stern, who will be covered later in this video. In the late 1920s, Ratosh had begun consorting with Abba Ahimeir, and in 1930 he would join the Irgun. The Canaanite movement was a tiny, secular current that would peak in the 1940s and pushed to remake the contemporary Jewish identity into something entirely novel, and it owed its ideals all to fascism. The Canaanites argued that the new polity in Mandatory Palestine should be a territorial, linguistic Hebrew nation rooted in the history of Canaan, or the wider Fertile Crescent region, rather than a mere continuation of diaspora Judaism. The Canaanites heavily drew upon Near Eastern scholarship, including the Ugaritic texts, to claim cultural continuity with a broader current of pre-biblical Semitic civilizations, and to justify entirely rejecting Judaism as merely a transnational religion. For the Canaanites, a real nation required land and language. Artistically, the Canaanites favored biblical and Ugaritic modes, hapax legomena, and mythic imagery. Though they never went beyond being a significant undercurrent within the Zionist movement, the Canaanites provoked fierce criticism from the Hebrew cultural mainstream, being accused of a historicism and myth-making. When World War II began in September of 1939, Irgun leader David Raziel, imprisoned by the British, ordered a halt to anti-British operations, reasoning that defeating Nazi Germany ought to take precedent. Many revisionist leaders and Hatzohar members supported this decision, seeing the British war effort against Nazism as aligned with Zionist interests. In August of 1940, Ze'ev Jabotinsky suffered a fatal heart attack while visiting a Betar winter camp in the United States, devastating the Zionist movement. With Jabotinsky dead, Hatzohar, Betar, and the Irgun had no formal link to one another. Jabotinsky had left behind no immediate successor of equal stature, resulting in a power vacuum. In the midst of this chaos, a faction of the Irgun, led by a certain fascist named Avraham Stern, vehemently opposed the ceasefire with the British, arguing that the greatest threat to the Jewish national home was the British Empire itself, especially after the draconian immigration limits of the 1939 White Paper. This policy paper had capped Jewish immigration at 75,000 persons over the course of 5 years, and denied the establishment of a Jewish state, with the British imperialists envisioning instead a unitary Palestine with an Arab majority by 1949. The White Paper all at once seemed to shatter all hopes for any continued cooperation between the Zionists and the British Empire. Unable to reconcile their differences, Avraham Stern and his followers formally split off from the Irgun after Jabotinsky's death and formed Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, abbreviated more simply as Lehi. Lehi's declared purpose was to liberate the land of Israel from British imperialism by force and to establish a Jewish state. Its founders, including many veteran members of the Irgun, believed that armed struggle was the sole legitimate path to true Jewish sovereignty. In its earliest phase, Lehi first reached out to Fascist Italy and even Germany, hoping to secure military aid in overthrowing the British Mandate. Stern, although not sharing any common values with the Nazis, saw common cause against a mutual enemy, the British. Though discussions occurred, such as the proposed 1940 Jerusalem Agreement with Fascist Italy or Naftali Lubinczyk's mission to Werner Otto von Hentig in Beirut, none of these talks led to any formal treaties. The Irgun in particular, through coordination with the British Empire, intentionally sabotaged Lehi's attempts at brokering an agreement with Fascist Italy. Lehi always remained a small underground movement, numbering only a few hundred members. Though it successfully carried out bold actions against British military and police targets, its members operated in safe houses under false identities, refusing to disclose their true beliefs, avoiding neighborhood ties, and operating in extreme secrecy, funding operations through bank robberies, legal and illegal fundraisings, and the sale of forged documents. Lehi published underground papers such as Hamaksar and Hamaaseh, even running its own clandestine radio station. In retaliation for British crackdowns, Lehi carried out numerous attacks, bombing police stations and Royal Air Force installations, sabotaging railways, and killing British collaborators. One of the most significant figures to join Avraham Stern in this novel movement was the Ukrainian Jewish fascist Israel Eldad. Eldad had migrated to Mandatory Palestine in 1941 after a harrowing escape from war-torn Europe. When the war broke out in 1939, Eldad and his friend Menachem Begin had escaped together from Warsaw, though Begin was arrested by Soviet police in the middle of a chess game with Eldad, separating them for years. Upon arriving in Palestine, Eldad quickly rose to become a central leader of Lehi, working directly with Avraham Stern in 1942. Unfortunately, on February 12th of 1942, following his arrest by British law enforcement, Avraham Stern was shot and extrajudicially executed. After the murder of Stern by the British in February of 1942, Eldad became one of a triumvirate of Lehi commanders, alongside Natan Yelin-Mor, who handled diplomacy, and future Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, who handled operations. Yelin-Mor had been, from 1938 to 1939, the co-editor of Die Tat with Avraham Stern, the Irgun's Polish paper. As a leader of Lehi, he rejected the concept of Zionism altogether, and proclaimed that Lehi itself was not a Zionist movement. In his own words, quote, "Zionism is empty of all content, and no longer compels us forward to accomplish anything more. We are not a Zionist option, and it is not our duty to bring this or that party back to the proper path. We are the Hebrew liberation movement in the land of Israel. For us, Zionism is dead, and we no longer wish to busy ourselves trying to revive it or anything else of its kind," unquote. Regarding the Palestinian Arab population, Natan would declare, quote, "The national interests of the Hebrew people and the essential interests of the inhabitants of the land, without any distinction of national origin, religion, or race, dovetail with one another," unquote. In a distinct capacity from Shamir's role in military operations and Yelin-Mor's role in political and diplomatic affairs, Eldad served as Lehi's chief intellectual and propagandist. Under such aliases as Sambation and Eldad, he wrote articles for various underground newspapers, edited publications, and composed speeches delivered in court by Lehi defendants. His ideological writings during this period articulated a vision far more radical than mere statehood. He sought what he called Malkut Yisrael, or the Kingdom of Israel, meaning a sovereign Jewish kingdom within the biblical borders, with all the world's Jews living there, and the temple rebuilt in Jerusalem. Eldad's underground career was dramatic and perilous, as he was arrested by the British while trying to flee from a Tel Aviv apartment, injured in a fall from a water pipe, and imprisoned in Jerusalem in a body cast. Undeterred, he continued his political and philosophical writing from Cell 18 of the hospital ward at the Jerusalem Central Prison. In June of 1946, having healed sufficiently, Eldad escaped while on a visit to a dentist's clinic, from which Lehi fighters spirited him away. Lehi's new leaders pragmatically realigned the militia organization towards Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The USSR, being the only powerful nation generally committed to defeating Britain's imperial reach, could therefore be the only partner useful for achieving Jewish statehood. Despite this geopolitical realignment, the organization's rank and file continued to be largely comprised of fascists in the years to come. In 1943, Menachem Begin, a former Betar commander in Poland, who had escaped with General Anders's army from the USSR, arrived in Mandatory Palestine, assuming command of the Irgun during a severe internal leadership crisis. Under Begin's leadership, the Irgun resumed guerrilla operations against British installations, coordinated with the Haganah from mid-1945 onwards in anti-British activities, and launched hundreds of operations against British soldiers, policemen, and officials, aiming to make the British imperial mandate untenable. Begin's political acumen solidified the Irgun's role in the Revisionist movement as he forged ties with the more moderate Zionist factions, who now saw armed resistance as perhaps a necessary evil. In October of 1945, only a few months after the end of World War II, Lehi, the Irgun, and the Haganah formed the United Resistance Movement to coordinate their operations. The Irgun and Lehi continued independent attacks, including hundreds of raids on British military and police installations, high-speed assassinations, and acts of sabotage such as the Night of the Airfields in February of 1946, during which they destroyed dozens of British aircraft across Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and the Galilee. Despite British deportations of revolutionary Zionists to Africa beginning in October of 1944, specifically Operation Snowball, which sent 439 detainees to internment camps in Eritrea, the Zionists would ultimately emerge victorious. Following the UN General Assembly's November 29, 1947 vote to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states, Arab militias launched widespread attacks against Jewish civilians, beginning with the ambush of 2 Jewish buses the very next day. The Irgun immediately responded by conducting reprisals against Arab targets to deter further massacres, as seen in the Haifa refinery attacks in December of 1947. By March of 1948, Arab forces had successfully blockaded Jerusalem, threatening its 100,000 Jewish residents with starvation. The Irgun collaborated tacitly with the Haganah and Palmach units in mixed operations, such as during Operation Nachshon in April of 1948, hoping to break the siege of Jerusalem and protect Jewish convoys and settlements from complete isolation. Despite harsh criticism for civilian casualties, the Irgun maintained that only overwhelming force could ensure the survival of the Yishuv. Throughout this period, Israel Eldad remained active as a co-leader of Lehi. During the 1948 war, Eldad was critical of Begin's Irgun for not fighting against the IDF during the Atlalina affair. Towards the war's end, Eldad disguised himself as a foreign journalist to sneak past military roadblocks and join the battle for Jerusalem. On May 14th of 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel. He immediately ordered the dissolution of all independent militias, including the Irgun, paving the way for full integration of Irgun fighters into the newly formed IDF. Upon Israel's declaration of independence, Lehi accepted the authority of the new State of Israel. On May 29th of 1948, some 700 Lehi fighters formally enlisted in the IDF, while a contingent of around 300 continued as an independent unit, defending Jerusalem until the city's full clearance. Following Lehi's assassination of the Swedish nobleman and UN mediator Folke Bernadotte in September of 1948, the Provisional Israeli government proscribed Lehi. After Israeli independence, both Jewish and Arab Lehi veterans organized politically as the Fighters List, led by Natan Yelin-Mor and Israel Eldad. At one party meeting, Israel Eldad lectured on Tzolam, Jacob's Ladder, which would become the name of his influential journal. Eldad went on to teach Torah and Hebrew literature until Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, fearing he would imbue students with Lehi ideology, had him dismissed. In December of 1948, Menachem Begin established the party named Herut, also known as Freedom. Herut was a conservative nationalist political party which incorporated former Irgun members, Betar veterans, and Hatzohar activists. Abba Ahimeir would quickly become a member of Herut's editorial board, following its 1948 foundation. In one interview in 1949, 4 years after World War II, Ahimeir would express that Ze'ev Jabotinsky had favored the Italian people the most out of any European people. Despite its extensive reach, Herut failed to form a consensus around itself. Many revisionist Zionists opposed the moderate Herut party, including many of Jabotinsky's revisionists, as well as the Fighters List, which stood against it in the 1949 elections, as the list won merely a single seat in the Knesset before its dissolution. Herut met much opposition during the 1949 elections, from without as well, with the dominant Workers' Party constantly drawing parallels between Menachem Begin and Benito Mussolini. Herut was painted as a fascist organization, despite the moderate Begin having abandoned his fascist sympathies years prior. In the January of 1949 elections, Herut won 11.5% of the vote, placing fourth and forming the backbone of the parliamentary opposition against the center-left Labor Zionists, who controlled the parliament. Herut's founding manifesto first and foremost called for a greater Israel on both banks of the Jordan River. It embraced democracy, freedom of speech, and civil liberties, promoted private enterprise, and called for a reduction in state intervention alongside a strong defense force. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Herut remained in opposition, pushing the labor establishment to adopt tougher security stances and open economic reforms. With the deaths of Jabotinsky and Stern, the sidelining of Ahimeir, and the fall of Lehi and its fighters list, the era of fascist Zionism was over. In 1969, Yitzhak Shamir joined Menachem Begin's Herut party and later led the Herut-Likud alliance. In 1973, Herut merged with the Liberal Party and several smaller right-wing and religious factions to form the Likud Party, which saw the merger of Revisionist Zionism with other strands of Israeli nationalism. Likud was backed by revisionist labor unions such as the National Federation in Eretz Israel, as well as the Leumit healthcare services. Israel's 1977 political crisis saw Likud win a historic victory, ending nearly 3 decades of center-left dominance. Menachem Begin became prime minister, inaugurating a period of diplomatic breakthroughs, economic liberalization, and support for Jewish migrants and peripheral communities. In 1980, following the rise of Likud, the State of Israel officially recognized Lehi's contributions to the nation's development, establishing the Lehi Medal and commemorating its 125 fallen in annual ceremonies. Memorials, museums such as the Small Lehi Museum in Tel Aviv's Florentine, and monuments in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Ayalon Forest still honor Lehi's fighters and leaders. In 1983, Yitzhak Shamir became the Prime Minister of Israel as a member of Likud. He had come quite a long way from being merely a member of Jabotinsky's Betar, to joining the Irgun, to aiding Avraham Stern in forming Lehi, to leading Lehi, to becoming the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. As Prime Minister, Shamir took a hardline stance against territorial compromise. He would, most notably, become the ideological mentor of Benjamin Netanyahu. He was also, fun fact, an admirer of the Irish Republican struggle, and even took on the nickname Michael, inspired by the Irish Republican leader, Michael Collins. By the 1990s, Israel Eldad had become known as the doyen of Israeli nationalists. When he died in January of 1996, his funeral was attended by future Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Lehi commander and former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir. Eldad was buried on the Mount of Olives at the foot of the grave of his mentor and friend, the Israeli fascist poet Or Tzvi Greenberg. Benjamin Netanyahu's own father, Benzion Netanyahu, was also an active member of the Revisionist Zionist Movement. Benzion was in fact a close friend of Abba Ahimeir, co-editor of the Hebrew monthly Betar from 1933 to 34, editor for the revisionist daily paper HaYarden in Jerusalem from 1934 to 35, and most significantly, an aide to Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Following Jabotinsky's death, and until 1948, Benzion became the executive director of the New Zionist Organization of America. Benzion was a staunch believer in Greater Israel and petitioned against the 1947 UN partition plan for Palestine. The story of revisionist Zionism is, whether some would like to admit it or not, the foundational narrative of Jewish sovereignty itself. What began as a dissident faction dismissed as radical conclusively proved to be the only current of Zionism that correctly understood the Jewish people's predicament and the measures required for their survival. Jabotinsky was excoriated by the Zionist establishment when he penned the Iron Wall in 1923, yet every decade since has vindicated his analysis. The Arabs of Palestine would not consent to Jewish sovereignty unless they were compelled to recognize its irreversible reality, something that they still have not done. For those Zionists who knew that Israel would need to be a nation reborn through national discipline and collective purpose, fascism was there. At every moment, the revisionist Zionists were proven to be correct about everything that mattered, correct that Arab violence could never be appeased by restraint, correct that the British could never be trusted to aid the Zionist movement, correct that the United Nations could never protect Jewish rights, correct that territorial concessions could never bring peace, correct that a Jewish state could only survive through national power, not international goodwill. The revisionists were right. History has proven them right, and as long as Israel faces enemies who seek its destruction, Jabotinsky's Iron Wall will need to be maintained as the only foundation upon which peace can eventually be built. This is the enduring legacy of revisionist Zionism, and this is why, despite all the calumnies, it remains the most vital current in modern Jewish political thought.